Welcome to The Quiet Truth, where lay Catholics wake up to a million screaming, whispering, pleading, begging, cajoling, lying, flattering demons attacking their children. I'm Tom Borek. With this episode, Be Very Afraid for the Children and Protect Them. In our last episode, we talked about the dangers of the secular culture to adults and how we all have a tendency to believe that we are immune, just as we have a tendency to believe that we're immune to the effects of advertising. We think that we're not going to be affected by subliminal or unconscious messages that we pick up from the media. We believe that we're not going to be affected by the lure of the crowd and peer pressure and the desire to fit in. We think that we're not going to be affected by the near occasions of sin, by being tempted by the idea of various kinds of sin without consequences. But the truth is, we are vulnerable. We're vulnerable mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. It's part of the human condition. And our offspring are, if anything, even more vulnerable. Imagine that you're assisting your parish counting the collection, something that I've done on a number of occasions. So after Mass, you're sitting in a church basement or in some room with a handful of other parishioners, and you're all counting the money. You've got the 20s and the 10s and the 5s and the 1s. And so you always count the big bills first. You go 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, and the 10s, 130, 140, 150, 160, then the 5s, 165, 170, 175, 180, 185, singles, 186, 187, 188, 189. I can usually do a pretty good job with that, but every once in a while what'll happen is the person on my left or on my right or across the table will start counting his or her money out loud. And suddenly the job is much, much more difficult, and I'm more likely to make mistakes and have to start over again. Now let's imagine that at the same time, while someone is trying to do that counting and dealing with other people counting out loud at the same time, they're also being tempted to sin. Let's say someone else in the room is trying to seduce them and appeal to their lust. And let's say that someone else in the room is trying to appeal to their greed and tell them about some Ponzi scheme where they can, that seems too good to be true, that's going to give them a lot of money. And let's assume that someone else there is busy trying to appeal to the person's pride and tell them about something that they can do that's going to enhance that and that avenue of sin. And let's assume that while you're trying to juggle all these messages and do your job at the same time, there's some fella in the corner and he's reading from a history text and he's droning on and on and on, and most of it is information that you're familiar with, but it's peppered with lies, with foolishness, with things that are not true and that tend to mislead you. And now on top of all that, let's assume that you're 14 years old. This is a very bad state of affairs. And it comes at a time when Catholic education is kind of in crisis. As hard as the Catholic educators work, they find that they're frequently instructed to water down the message of the faith, just in order to keep the enrollment up, to allow for government funding, and to keep everybody happy. They're sometimes instructed not to forcefully explain the Catholic teaching on divorce, or on premarital sex, or even on the need to attend Sunday Mass. And the situation is even worse as you get into colleges and universities, where you have most Catholic schools now allow men and women unrestricted access to each other's living quarters. They teach a kind of theology that's not only not Catholic, it may be explicitly Marxist theology or feminist theology or Protestant theology or even some kind of weird earth-worshipping Druid theology at the Catholic school, which makes people even more vulnerable. During the past 50 years, Catholic parents have had a really tough time, and the best of them, the most faith-filled, energetic, careful, loving parents have often met with disaster, as a huge number of our young people in each generation fall away from the church, fall away from God, just sort of casually take their leave, despite the best efforts of their parents. I know two couples in particular who worked as hard as anyone and who had the kind of devout faith that I admire and made absolutely sure that each of their children attended Catholic schools from kindergarten to the end of high school and then went on to Catholic colleges or universities. And yet, at the end of all that, just kind of casually walked away from the church because of all the problems that I'm talking about here, because of all the messages they received, and because they were so unprepared to deal with them. Once we understand the significance of this problem and its scope, business as usual is not an option. And the problem is this: our children and young people are bombarded nearly every waking hour of every single day with foolish and evil messages with which they cannot cope. And because they are young people, they believe these messages. They are almost unbelievably credulous. I had an opportunity a while back to address a class full of juniors at a well-known Catholic college. And one of the most academically successful of these upper-class students was presenting a paper on educational theory, in which his primary source was an internet site run by a woman whose only qualifications to pontificate about educational theory were that she was an Army spouse, and that because her family moved around a lot, her kids had been in a lot of different school districts. And this student was truly bewildered to find out that that was not an accepted authoritative source of information about educational theory. And most of the rest of the class was similarly shocked. If these, fairly successful upper class college students didn't understand that something that's stated on the internet on a slick site isn't necessarily true or isn't necessarily even authoritative, what about our 8-year-olds, our 9-year-olds, our 10-year-olds, our 14-year-olds? They are even more vulnerable. If they see it on the internet, if they see it in print, if they hear it from 2 or 3 of their friends, it's the truth. And frequently it seems to them to be even more the truth than whatever it is that their parents are telling them. A few years ago, I had an opportunity to sit in on a meeting that was held at an Catholic elementary middle school. It was a meeting for all faculty, all staff, all administrators, and all students. They had to have 2 sessions, once in the morning, one in the afternoon, at which they heard from somebody who was described as an internet security expert. And this internet security expert began by saying that it was crazy to think that you could raise kids without giving them unrestricted access to the internet. That you absolutely had to give kids unrestricted access to the internet because the software that's designed to protect them against pornography doesn't really work very well, and because children need, from a very young age, from age 8 at least, unrestricted access to the internet in order to become citizens of our modern technological world. And his idea of internet safety was that all the parents and all the administrators and all the teachers should be instructed on how to tell kids how to avoid giving out personal identifiable information on the internet and how to avoid being tricked by adults pretending to be their peers. So in other words, to protect them from kidnapping and other kinds of predation. Here's what the fellow did not talk about. He did not address the question of how you could protect your kids from arguments and material pushing them toward atheism. He did not offer any suggestions as how you could deal with the natural curiosity of adolescents about sexual matters and the draw that they have toward pornography. He did not talk to us about how to educate kids to distinguish between truth and falsity, between evil and good. In other words, he didn't do anything to tell us how we could protect our children's intellectual development and their spiritual development. He didn't tell us anything about how to preserve their minds and their souls. At the end of the meeting, there was not a word of disagreement from the faculty or from the administration. And of course the kids, if they weren't already convinced, came away with the idea that they were plenty mature enough to navigate the internet and all the different voices and all the different material there without any kind of supervision or help. Under these circumstances, with this much negative stuff coming in, The traditional way of educating Catholic kids institutionally, that is, daily prayer, Sunday Mass, and 1 to 5 hours of religious instruction during certain school years, is simply not sufficient to balance the things out of whack, because they hear so much more from the secular culture than they do from trustworthy sources. Next time, we're going to deal with the nuts and bolts of this and begin our step-by-step guide on how to protect children from this danger and how to help them navigate through this cultural wasteland to eternal salvation. Thank you for your kind attention.